Welcome to Once Upon Tonight, where every night begins with a story. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let your imagination wander beneath the stars. A long time ago, in a dusty town that sat quietly between two long-forgotten train tracks, there was a man named Silas who sold maps, but not just any kind. His maps didn't show highways or cities. They didn't lead to gas stations or rest stops. Silas made maps that led to moments. His shop was small, with shelves that leaned and drawers full of old parchment and ink bottles with cork stoppers. There was a bell on the door that barely rang anymore, but Silas didn't mind. He wasn't in a rush. People came when they needed to. One afternoon, a woman stepped inside. She looked unsure, the kind of unsure that doesn't come from being lost, but from forgetting what direction she was trying to go in the first place. "I don't really know what I'm looking for," she said. Silas nodded. "That's when the best maps find you." He asked her a few questions, nothing deep, just enough to feel the weight she carried. Then he disappeared behind a curtain and returned with a scroll, carefully tied with string. "This one," he said, "leads to a place where you'll remember something important. Not sure what, but it's always worth the trip." She took it home, followed it the next day. It didn't lead her far, just to a hill outside town she hadn't stood on since childhood. But as the wind moved through the tall grass and the sun dropped low, she remembered her father's old laugh and how he used to lift her up to see above the crowd. She cried, then smiled, then went back to thank Silas. The maps kept going. A young man was given one that led to an alley behind the library, where he found a mural he hadn't noticed before. It sparked a drawing in his head he'd been trying to chase for years. An older couple received a map that simply led them to the park bench, where they'd had their first real conversation, 52 years earlier. They didn't say much, just held hands and let the silence do the talking. No one really knew how Silas made the maps. He never said. He just seemed to know what people needed to find, even if they didn't. Then one morning, the shop didn't open. The door was locked, the bell silent. Inside, through the dusty window, a single map lay on the counter. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It had only 4 words written on the front. Where he went next. No one ever opened it. They didn't need to. Far beyond the usual roads, in a wind-swept valley surrounded by soft hills and low-hanging clouds, there was a small village known only to those who had already been there once. It wasn't on any map. There were no signs pointing the way. People didn't find it by accident, they found it when they needed it. In the heart of the village stood a long, narrow building made of stone and warm wood, with ivy climbing up its sides and windows that flickered softly at night. It was called the waiting room. But it wasn't a hospital or a train station or anything you'd expect. It was a place where people came to rest when they didn't know what to do next. Inside were armchairs of every shape and size, bookshelves filled with stories from lives that hadn't finished yet, tables with tea that never went cold, and a small wooden box near the door, where guests could leave a note, a question, or a name they couldn't forget. No one ran the waiting room. There were no check-ins or schedules. People arrived, stayed as long as they needed, and left when they were ready. One autumn, a man named Reed arrived. He didn't remember how he got there, only that he'd been walking for what felt like forever. He was tired, not the kind of tired sleep could fix, but the kind that came from trying to hold too many things inside for too long. He sat in a chair by the window and didn't move for hours. The next morning, he poured himself tea and wandered the shelves. He pulled down a book with no title and opened it to find the first page completely blank. But as he flipped through, he began to see faint lines appear, memories, thoughts, moments he hadn't spoken aloud in years. They weren't written in ink, more like impressions. Each day he read a little more, wrote a little too. He left a note in the box near the door. "How do you know when it's time to leave?" The next day he found a folded paper tucked into his teacup. It read, "When you can carry the weight without holding your breath." 2 days later, he stood at the edge of the village, looking back one last time. The building didn't wave, didn't vanish. It simply waited for whoever might need it next. Reed didn't know where he was going, but he walked with lighter steps, not because he had all the answers, but because he no longer needed them to keep moving. A long, long time ago, in a town that always smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts and rain-soaked stone. There was a clock tower that never told the right time. It sat in the middle of the town square, tall and stubborn, its hands frozen at 11:11. The townspeople used it as a landmark, a meeting spot, or something to grumble about when their watches disagreed with the sky. But no one tried to fix it, except for May. May was 17 and curious in a way most people had forgotten how to be. Her father ran the little bookshop below the tower, and every day after school, she'd sit behind the counter, flipping through dusty atlases and old repair manuals. The clock had been broken since before she was born, but for some reason it fascinated her. One afternoon, after locking up the shop, May took the winding staircase up the inside of the tower. It creaked like it was surprised to see someone. Dust swirled in the sunlight as she climbed, step by careful step, until she reached the top. The clock's gears were enormous, rusted in places, silent in others. The hands were heavy and unmoving. She sat there for a while, just listening, not trying to fix anything yet, just watching how the light passed through the stained glass, how the silence felt more like waiting than stillness. And then, almost without thinking, she began to clean. Every evening after that, she returned, sometimes with oil, sometimes with tools, sometimes just with questions. She didn't tell anyone. It felt like a secret between her and time itself. Weeks passed. She polished the gears, studied their patterns, tightened bolts, and loosened the things that had seized up. It was quiet work, thoughtful work. And then one Thursday at exactly 3:17 p.m., just as a boy across the square leaned in to kiss a girl for the first time, the clock ticked. One click, then another, and then it began to turn, slowly, then steadily, until the great hands pointed to the actual time for the first time in decades. The bell rang once, then silence, then cheers. People rushed into the square, pointing, clapping, looking up like the sky had shifted, but May didn't come down right away. She sat at the top, heart beating faster than the gears she'd just mended. She didn't fix time, not really, but she reminded it to move again, and sometimes that's all it takes.